Sweden has seen no reduction in its emissions since 1990. Nor indeed has Denmark, the UK, the Netherlands, Belgium. I think Belgium's up 25%. When you take account of aviation, shipping, imports and exports, Sweden has done nothing on climate change so far, and nor have many other countries. So where do we go from here? Once we are honest about where we are and how much my generation has chosen to fail, how then do we turn that round and say, well, let's start to do something? Well, the take-home issues, I think, first is the Paris Agreement is much, much more challenging than most policymakers or scientists are prepared to admit if you put a microphone on them. If you drink a pint of beer with them, or half a litre of fizzy, cold Swedish beer, warm British flat beer is much better. Anyway, if you drink half a litre of beer with a politician or a scientist, they'll tell you how bad it is. But you put a microphone there and I'll tell you some optimistic nonsense about climate change. Long-term targets have no scientific basis. What you do by 2030, by 2045 in isolation is irrelevant. It's just in the future. It means basically doing nothing today. What matters are total carbon emissions. Every time we emit carbon dioxide, most of that will be in the atmosphere, changing the climate for the next 100 to 10,000 years. We are permanently changing the climate by this event here today. By getting here, by having the lights on, by all those other things, we are changing the climate for the next few thousand years. But despite all of this, I think we can just about hold the 2 degrees centigrade of warming. Only just. I think if I was asked in 3 years to speak here, I'd probably say it's not possible. I don't think 1.5 degrees centigrade is any longer possible, and I find that quite depressing to have to say that. Well, very depressing. So, what is Sweden's role in delivering Paris? To limit to a warming of 2 degrees centigrade, we have to understand the science and the maths of climate change. So, I could go through all this stuff that I normally do, but I'm not going to. I've got less time today. So, this is a talk, or this is part of a talk I recently used in Manchester as well, with our city council there. So, alternatively, it's all about pies, or tarts, or bula, something like that. To limit to 2 degrees centigrade of warming, we have a set global pie, which is the total amount of carbon that we can emit forever from now. And once we've used up that pie, that's the 2 degrees centigrade pie gone. There's no more pie left. And we have to split that amongst all the countries in the world fairly, and take into account of historical responsibility and how wealthy we are on those things. And then we would ask, what is a fair slice of that pie for the EU? And Sweden, of course, is a member of the EU, and the UK is at the moment. I'm hoping to get Swedish residency, so I can stay a member. So we then ask the question here, of the EU carbon budget, how much is Sweden's? So what's the slice of the carbon budget that belongs to Sweden? And this is work that Isaac, Stoddard, myself and colleagues at Seamless in Uppsala have been working on. Provisionally, for those that like numbers, it's somewhere between 300 and 600 million tonnes of carbon dioxide that Sweden can emit from now out to forever. And that may mean nothing to some of you, but emissions at the moment, if you include aviation and shipping, are about 50 million tonnes. So a bit of basic maths will tell you that you've got 6 to 12 years of current emissions, and then there'll be nothing left for Sweden. If you take a consumption-based approach, think of your imports and exports, you'd have much less than that time. This budget range includes aviation and includes shipping, both of which are conveniently ignored in the climate change law for Sweden, and indeed most countries in the world usually ignore those, and despite the fact they're a large part of emissions, probably in Sweden something like 15% or maybe more of all your emissions are aviation and shipping that you think are the responsibility of God or another country. It also excludes imports from other parts of the world, and you can make arguments for or against that, but it's worth bearing in mind it doesn't include those. So the headline message for Sweden, from a mitigation point of view, for reducing emissions, is that if we assume firstly that the poorer parts of the world, which are dominated by China, make really rapid changes in their energy systems, much more so than they're normally thought about possible, but I think are just about viable in talking with my Chinese colleagues and people elsewhere. So we're asking a lot of the poorer parts of the world, If Sweden is honest about its commitment to Paris, and the climate change law, I would have to say, is not honest about that commitment, and if its policies are to have a scientific base and are to based on equity, rather than basing them on astrology and inequity, which I would argue is where we are today, then Sweden needs to reduce its emissions at the absolute minimum 10% starting this year, and the next few years be up to 15% every single year. It would have been much less than that if we'd started in 1990 or 2000 or 2005, but in 2018 we still haven't started. That's at least a 75% reduction in emissions from Sweden by 2025. And a zero carbon energy system in our planes, our ships, our cars, our refrigerators, our industry by about 2035 to 2040. And this is very different from what we normally hear. So how does this differ from the climate law? It sounds today like I'm picking on Sweden. I'm in Sweden, I do the same thing if I was in Denmark recently or in the UK. I'm not picking on Sweden. Though I do think you have a greater responsibility because you are a more progressive country. People do look to Sweden for leadership. So I think actually, because of your history, you have a greater responsibility. So how different is it? Well, here we have the climate change law. This is Isaac and I doing our best interpretation using the Swedish EPA sort of, reports and so forth, about 6% per annum reduction. But notice, it excludes international aviation and shipping, which the Swedish government are planning to expand, to increase the amount of emissions from those sectors, and to lock in a high carbon future. It has no carbon budget framework. In other words, it is not based on science, it's based on astrology. It does include other greenhouse gases. We're assuming here that the reduction for carbon dioxide is the same as the other greenhouse gases. And I won't be talking about those, but the importance of agriculture must not be underestimated. Swedish people need to be eating less meat, drinking less milk. I'm not saying become vegetarian or vegan, but certainly move a long way away from those sorts of high carbon food stuff. If you look at the Johan Rockström recent paper along with his colleagues, their carbon law, as they've called it, the global carbon law, then it's about 7% per annum reduction rates. But I think it's worth bearing in mind that both of these include negative emission technologies. Johan Rockström's paper makes very clear the very large amount of technologies that he is relying on. And remember, he is like me, he's of the generation that's failed. So what we're really saying in papers like that is our generation has failed and the next generation will have to invent these technologies and make them work. Very dangerous, isn't it? Again, we hand the responsibility onto the next generation. They also exclude any concern about equity. They basically say the poor countries will have to do lots more again because we, the rich countries, want a larger part of the cake. That's what we're actually saying when you look at the numbers. If you were serious about 2 degrees centigrade, remember this is 2 degrees, not 1.5, then Sweden would take account of equity and would not rely on negative emission technologies or offsetting or every other form of con, fraud or swindlery. Then you would need something like the blue line on there at the bottom, the dotted line. Much, much more challenging. Now I don't want to just pick on Sweden, so let's have a look at the UK, just quickly. You have to say, in terms of the climate law, the Climate Act passed which we passed in the UK in 2008 is actually a much better document with much more sort of teeth involved in it than the Swedish climate change law is today, 10 years later. And I normally would not say there's good things about the UK compared to Sweden. But this is our trajectory for emissions. Let's take away all the noise off that. That's what our government are planning for, advised by quite a few scientists. And this is the work that I've done with colleagues in Manchester to show what we'd have to do if we were serious about 2 degrees centigrade for the UK. So it's very much like the Swedish position. We are doing something that is nowhere near what's necessary, and Britain, along with Sweden and the rest of the EU, is saying to the poor parts of the world, you cannot have as much carbon as would be reasonable for you to have because we want it for ourselves. We want to expand our airports, we want to fly to Bali, we want to carry on driving large Volvos. So what does all this mean for Sweden's climate law, if the law was to be in line with Paris? To meet its commitments, the law must be revised as a matter of absolute urgency. It should be based on explicit global carbon budgets for 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade, not based on soothsayers, astrologists, or some nonsense from economists. It needs to take account that poorer countries will take longer to make the move to a low-carbon future, and that is embedded in the Paris Agreement that Sweden signed up to. It's embedded in the Camp David Agreement. It's in the Copenhagen Accord. So Sweden repeatedly has signed up to that, and yet it has never taken that seriously, and it hasn't now. It needs to include aviation and shipping. You cannot just exclude difficult sectors just because it's inconvenient, which is what Sweden has done at the moment. It needs to rely on actually reducing our emissions, a radical idea, cutting the emissions, rather than saying we're going to use negative emission technologies, or offsetting, or any other form of scam. And I think it also needs to be, although the main focus needs to be on its territorial emissions, the emissions it has direct responsibility for, I think it also needs to be guided by its consumption-based emissions. In other words, the emissions related to its imports and its exports. So this screen here, the laptop this is working from today, all of these things are made in other parts of the world, and we blame them for the carbon emissions, and then we buy their products, whether it's our clothes, our equipment and so forth. So we should at least be guided by those emissions. And just to give you an idea, Sweden's emissions with aviation and shipping and just territorial are about 50 million tonnes. If you include consumption-based emissions, they're about 82 million tonnes. So it makes a big difference. So Sweden is relying on other parts of the world and then blaming them for their emissions. So to conclude, Sweden's climate law needs a scientific and equity-based foundation. Policymakers need to demonstrate integrity and courage. But there's a really important role for us in this as well. We are absolutely central to this, that we need to support the policymakers when they make difficult decisions. They'll be criticised by the economists, they'll be criticised by certain political parties. Other people will say it's not realistic. We have to be there saying, actually, this is the only way forward. We have to be honest if we are going to resolve climate change. This is an existential threat, and we have to respond to it. I'm going to start to finish off with a quote from Alex Steffen. It came out of a Twitter discussion that we had last year. Winning slowly is basically the same thing as losing outright. In the face of both triumphant denialism, which we see in Australia and the US, and a little bit in Sweden, but not so much so, and predatory delay, which we see lots of in Sweden, Norway, the UK, the EU, and most other wealthy parts of the world, where we're deliberately delaying real action. Trying to achieve climate action by doing the same things the same old way means defeat. It guarantees defeat. And that is what we're doing at the moment. We are still sat in the UK with a mindset from the 19th century, in Sweden with a mindset from the 20th century, and we are facing system-level problems of the 21st century. We have to think differently. And at the absolute core of that must be the idea of integrity. So on that note, thank you for listening.